Science fiction isn't just escapism. In fact, I would argue that it's a lot more, and that really good science fiction goes way beyond escapism. It's more of a philosophical thing. Science fiction is about celebrating our faith in progress. It's about science and what science has done for humanity. Now, no work of art in any media can be fully appreciated and understood without context. Even the most formulaic novel, film or audio recording will reflect and show the influence of the culture that it emerges from. And evaluating its quality beyond the most personal, subjective, individual response to it is impossible without context. And when it comes to science fiction, an understanding of history is particularly relevant, since the evolution of science fiction was so dependent on the response of the writers to the technology that they saw developing around them. As well as displaying how the possible implications of that technology might affect the individual and society, the science fiction writer needs more than just the pure, archaic imagination of story to create their work. Unlike the fantasy author, who needs only to draw on the anachronisms of magic, the supernatural, religion, and long-established narrative gambits, the science fiction writer instead extrapolates the new from observing how science, which is natural, not supernatural, which is rational, not inexplicable, how science has changed the world as it has developed since antiquity. So to understand SF, and to evaluate it with any kind of objectivity at all, a basic grasp of history is essential, because history is science fiction's context. So while you'll find many videos out there looking at the history of SF with varying degrees of accuracy, I will add, these mean very little unless we look at history itself as the context of SF. And I've mentioned that twice because I can't emphasize it enough. So to begin with, let's look at an important distinction between science and technology. Science is theory that is made concrete, objective, and undeniably factual. You notice I say factual rather than truthful, because truth is personal and subjective. Facts are objective and real. Through experimentation that leads to proof. You have theory, devise experiments, you repeat the experiment to see whether you get the proof. Is it consistent? Consistency is the mark of science. Once an experiment is devised and repeated and always yields the same result, the scientific theory behind it is confirmed. So the theory is a major part of science. Technology, of course, is the application of science. But the strangest thing of all about technology is, of course, that it preceded scientific theory and method. Animals, such as apes and crows, experimented with the materials around them in the natural world to access food. We're talking about tool use and, to a degree, tool making. For example, if you get chimps, they will get a twig of the right size, they'll strip it down a bit and pop it into a termite nest to extract those toothsome insects so they can eat them. Many passerine birds, perching birds, will smash snails against rocks to shatter their shells to get inside, so they're using an anvil. Mankind similarly used such resources, shaping flints into hand axes, fashioning spears from branches, and making clubs from the antlers of deer and antelopes. And this was trial and error, find out by doing. And in pre-literate cultures, theory arose out of experiment, and those successful techniques were passed down through oral tradition. So technology actually precedes humanity. It also precedes scientific theory, which only appears with humanity. Science itself, which took many centuries to develop, was the establishment of the framework of mathematics and physics. This begins with the earliest writing, mathematics arising in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East on wax tablets engraved with the accounting of food storage. Writing begins to record mathematics, to record accounting. And as the classical world emerged, Greece, Rome, and other Mediterranean cultures which played their part, such as Egypt, science began a long period of codification as it emerged from the fog of anachronistic superstition. Fittingly, science fiction begins to emerge at this very point in history with the birth of the classical era. However, this is not true science fiction, as scientific theory, which lags behind technology, is still much trial and error. People have made things work, but they don't always know why they work. The full potential of science remains concealed. So SF from antiquity, and here's an example, Lucian's Selected Dialogues, which contains the true history, often cited as one of the earliest works of SF. You know, that sort of SF from antiquity is what we call Proto SF, and it's proto from the beginnings of. It's just the signs of what is to come. Now, science does not really begin to emerge undeniable and triumphant over supernatural and religious beliefs until the 18th century. So it's incorrect to call science fiction until that point at the very least. Science fiction from antiquity to a few centuries ago is definitively proto-SF. It's not true science fiction. It is arguably part of the process of the emergence of science as writers and those working with technology counter-inspire and cross-fertilize each other with ideas. There are flying machines, for example, and a quest for immortality in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest book in the world, some 4,000 years old. But this is a narrative born of superstitious belief. It is fantasy. It is fundamentally a religious work. Proto-SF, however, established the twin roots of the science fiction tree in the classical era, and those roots were the traveller's tale and its opportunity for satire, and the utopian society and its attendant dangers. These are the two roots of SF. If we look again, for example, at Lucian of Samosata, who was born around AD 120 and died about 60 years later, the true history, which is only about 32 pages long, is a very bizarre narrative about space travel and aliens and strange beings. So it has tropes we recognise, but it is quite absurd. And in his introduction to it, Lucian really sets out his stall, and he's honest about what he's doing. He's saying that travellers' tales, you can't trust them. People come back with all these bizarre stories. They've been to another country to explore, and they come back and they say things like, oh, there's people in this country, no heads, but they've got faces in their chests. And he sets out to say, this is all lies. I'm a travel writer. I'm going to tell you loads of lies. So I'm being honest about that. So he's satirizing the unreliable narrators of travel writing. Tall tales of exploration and exploration itself to unknown lands, to the sea and space, remain mainstays of science fiction even now. Most people still see speculation around space travel as the basic identifier of SF. We can go back a bit further, though, to Plato. Now, Plato, of course, wrote down the Socratic dialogues, and Socrates himself didn't write anything down. Plato wrote them down later, and he supposedly fictionalized them based on what he could recall. And there are two dialogues, one called Timaeus and one called Critias, and there was meant to be a third one that was never written, which talk about Atlantis. And Timaeus was written down about 360 BC, so it's a good while, it's hundreds of years before Lucian of Samosata. And the society of Atlantis is described as a perfect society, but it succumbs to decadence and natural disaster. In Plato's Republic, written in 375 BC, Plato theorizes an ideal society run by technocratic mathematicians, scientists, and it may well be a dystopia for many, and it is believed by many to be the basis of dystopian fiction. And interestingly enough, Wells had similar ideas many, many years later in The Shape of Things to Come, in which the world is run after a devastating war by technocratic scientific airmen. And of course, back in the days of ancient Greece, Athenian democracy was anything but democratic in the way that we would recognize it. There was slavery, no suffrage for women, and so on and so on. So it's out of these two taproots, exploration and utopia, that science fiction's tree trunk, its Yggdrasil if you like, grows. As technology flourishes and becomes more understood, as experimenters reveal the theory behind their trial and error, Proto-SF begins to become more commonplace. From the Renaissance onwards, it flowers. It's inconsistent, but is present as writers combine the inspiration of exploration and discovery with utopian political theorizing. So Marco Polo, the explorer, gives way to Thomas More's Utopia. Jonathan Swift comes along next with Gulliver's Travels, and he combines exploration, satire and dystopian world building more tellingly than anyone before him, and he puts them into the same melange. So that's a really important moment as well. A list of Proto-SF authors, and there are hundreds of them, would include Voltaire, Casanova, Margaret Cavendish, Paltok, many others. And by the late 18th century, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, has exploded across Europe, and with it, scientific method is firming up. And in the face of growing proof of the efficiency of science, religion and magic have declined. People increasingly enjoy the material benefits of science as more of its theory emerges from applied method. Improving technology and engineering, medicine, mathematics and physics become less chance-oriented and more systematic. In the Enlightenment, science is truly born and flowering. But can we really call the flourishing Proto-S of this era and earlier science fiction? No, not yet, because as the Enlightenment begins to take further hold of imagination and society, a counter-revolution against the Enlightenment begins. By now, it's the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and there are some artists who are deeply concerned about the dangers suggested by rapid and unchecked scientific advance, and also the very nature of science as being something reductionist that brings everything down to clockwork. These artists feel that perhaps everything is becoming too rational, too cut and dried. What was once a slow growth, checked by the totalitarian power of the church, and a populace limited by its own illiteracy, has become a steam-driven ride through accelerating change. So these artists, despite being fascinated by science, are also dismayed. They see the beauty, awe and terror of nature being transformed into a set of determinist formulae by physicists, chemists and biologists. Are men, animals and astronomical bodies just like machines, behaving in accordance only with physical forces and internal templates governed by mathematics? Is science explaining our sense of wonder away? These artists react to this, seeking a rebalancing through poetry, painting, music and fiction. We call these artists the Romantics, and their fixation is on the sublime, that sense of the awe, beauty and terror of the natural universe. In science fiction, we call it the sense of wonder. The Romantics seek to bring man's imagination back into the picture of progress and to rekindle the sense of wonder anew. Two of the most noted poets of the Romantic era were George Gordon, known as Lord Byron, and Percy Bysshe Shelley. They were the kind of rock star outsiders of their day, regarded as dangerous atheists but brilliant writers, and both were fascinated by all kinds of things, but especially in experiments with galvanism, electricity. One of their circle is Mary, a young woman whose father is a radical political theorist, whose mother was the founder of modern feminism, but she has died giving birth to Mary. Now, Mary is given an extensive and daunting reading list by her father while she is still a child, and he crams her with all these texts, all kinds of things, and she is a bit of a prodigy like her parents. She forms a relationship with the older Percy Bysshe Shelley, whom she later marries, and she's further schooled in literature, radicalism and emergent science by him and Lord Byron. This culminates at the famous night, the infamous night, at the Villa Diodati in Switzerland, where Byron, his doctor John Polidori, Shelley and Mary conceive a ghost story competition. And as part of Romanticism's reaction against the classical calm of the Enlightenment's mechanistic theories, the Gothic has arisen anew and has been in vogue for some 20 years or more. And while the others produce only fragments of vampire fiction and the like, Mary, under Percy's iron hand, writes Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. It is the story of a brilliant scientist who creates a biological artificial intelligence, who then neglects to foster and nurture his creation carefully. Science runs amok if unchecked. 5% of the original 1818 text of Frankenstein is in Shelley's hand. His input is editorial, stylistic, and is conceptual, and it's undeniable. And that's why, at this point, with the publication of Frankenstein in 1818, we call SF scientific romance. Romance as opposed to realism. Story as opposed to something capturing the innate psychology of the time. Scientific romance emerges from the romantic reaction to the scientific character of the Enlightenment. It remains the ideal term for SF from 1818 to 1926, when the term science fiction is coined and its modern form coalesces as a genre in magazines designed specifically to codify it as a distinct type of marketable fiction. Now, Brian Aldiss wrote that SF is usually expressed in Gothic or post-Gothic mode. As Frankenstein emerged from a Gothic fiction writing exercise, this is why we sometimes see it as a kind of horror fiction, and the Gothic still stains SF. If you take Alien, for example, 1979, a film made 46 years ago and still being franchised and repeated now, based on stories published in 1939 by A.E. Van Vogt, Alien is often described as a horror film. But horror isn't a genre, it's a bricolage. Some of it is science fiction, some of it is fantasy, the supernatural, and some of it is actually possible, crime fiction. And a bricolage is rather like a Venn diagram. If you've got an oval laid over other categories and it meshes them together. It's also a way of packaging and marketing. It's not the genre, it's a bricolage. Genres do have definable edges. The Gothic milieu that surrounded the birth of scientific romance explains why so much SF since then is Gothic. If you look at Poe and Verne after Shelley, they worked with the age-old traveller's tale, again the taproot of SF. For example, in Edgar Allan Poe's only novel, The Narrative of A. Gordon Pym, and Verne with his extraordinary voyages, as he called them, beneath ground, beneath the sea, and into space. If you look at the writing of science fiction writer and historian Adam Roberts, Adam writes about how train travel in the 19th century, in the Industrial Revolution, caused a boom in railway station book sales, people reading more novels on long train journeys. Even Verne's Gun Club members in From the Earth to the Moon have a large library on board their projectiles, so they have something to do while they're travelling. A lot is happening in publishing at this point. And then came Wells, 1895, The Time Machine is published, a utopian writer, a science teacher, and a political radical. And you see how these things go right the way back to the classical period? He took scientific romance to the next level and set the template for modern SF. Time travel, alien invasion, genetic engineering, heavier than air flight, atomic weapons, optics, utopias. Wells strode like a colossus into modernity. He starts producing his fiction shortly after Impressionism and all the other visual art movements start to happen in France from the 1870s onwards. It's no coincidence that Wells' flowering coincides with and brings science fiction into line with the new ways that artists had been forced to work by the new age of mechanical reproduction which had been growing around them. Photography, mass cheap printing, film, audio recording, later television, radio. In the 75 years from 1850 to 1925, Art was no longer something that just a handful of people saw in galleries. Music was no longer something that you had to catch in live performance. These things could be disseminated through photography, mass printing, film, audio recording, then radio and television. It's really worth thinking about how different our consciousness was before these mass means of getting images and ideas to everybody came about. So science fiction was literally the spirit of the age as modernism in the arts exploded and Wells became world famous. Alongside him, Jack London, Zamyatin, Aldous Huxley all arose outside the mass magazine culture which had emerged with dime novels and penny dreadfuls in a big way in the 18th and 19th century. Alongside Impressionism, Cubism, Futurism, Dada and Surrealism, as these things reigned, SF left scientific romance behind and became science fiction, and genre SF was born. The term science fiction was coined in 1926, distilled by a SF fan writing a letter published in a pulp magazine. That magazine was Amazing Stories, and he suggested to its editor Hugo Gernsback that there was a better term than scientifiction, a terrible conflated word, proving how terrible conflated words are. He said, why not science fiction? Scientifiction was never going to catch on. So science fiction is what codified genre SF. For the first time there was a magazine dedicated to science fiction, and it was named a science fiction magazine, and those are the roots of genre SF. The appearance of amazing and this descriptor science fiction are the marker of the appearance of genre science fiction itself. That is, SF that was published in magazines that spanned a whole school of SF that displayed the influence and heritage of a particular market category presented in a particular publishing form. You've got to remember that there were no books labelled science fiction until around 1950. So there was a 25-year period after the term science fiction was coined until those books appeared. And they were anthologies of stories from the magazines, serials fixed up to novels and so on. So science fiction was a pulp magazine form, and that's genre SF. It's worth remembering, of course, that science fiction also continued its evolution outside genre publications like Amazing Stories and Astounding and so on. It continued outside the genre packaging that these magazines came in. It continued outside the magazine pulp tradition, full stop. SF writer Bruce Sterling described this science fiction that's outside genre SF as slipstream SF. And the term is, in the words of the SF Encyclopedia, it's something that designates stories which make use of SF devices but which are not genre SF. They have some of the same stuff, but they're not packaged and marketed in that way, and they don't draw on the pulp writing traditions. Slipstream SF is SF published, packaged and marketed as part of the mainstream or literary fiction market. Some examples would be things like, for example, Brave New World. Brave New World was never published in a magazine. 1984, again, never published as a magazine serial. The Handmaid's Tale, Never Let Me Go. These are classic examples of slipstream. A slipstream is a nautical or aeronautical term. A ship or an airplane may create a current in the media it's moving through, a stream around it that gives fellow travellers, like these mainstream writers I've described, a free ride without their being tainted with the perceived sensationalism of genre SF. More on slipstream and other uses of that term in an upcoming video. But back to genre SF. Genre SF was more of an Enlightenment project tinged with Gothic than it was a modernist one, because it lacked the ambition of modernism for fiction that was ostensibly about the future. It was tied to pulp voicings and didn't reflect what was happening in mainstream literature, where modernism, where use of advanced literary techniques was more and more of a thing. The genre SF of 1926 to around 1950 used traditional techniques and conservative linear approaches, which meant that it didn't fully accommodate modernism and it didn't stand up to what it actually was, what it was intended to be. As Brian Geisen said to William S. Burroughs, writing is 50 years behind painting, and while modernist writers like Joyce, Eliot and others seemed stuck on realism, SF did not become modern science fiction until it began to embrace modernist literary techniques in the 1950s. And one of the first examples of this was the Bester used when he used typography dotted around the page like concrete poetry, and then it became full-blown in the 1960s with the English New Wave. So science fiction became modern science fiction in this era. The satire and social science of the 50s and then the advanced modernism of the 1960s, when it became allied with the counterculture, civil rights, pop art, rock music and the avant-garde. But by the late 1980s, SF, genre SF, as a modernist project, began to be subjected to the inevitable cultural changes of modernism, as the pace of artistic innovation and the audience's expectation of novelty, of progressing, continuing newness, inevitably began to slow down. As the new mass media of video recording, 24-hour TV, and then the internet overexposed the modernist arts, which had been disseminated since the birth of photography. People had seen more art and more innovation in the arts in 130 years than they'd seen in all of human history. We were programmed by the condition of modernity to always expect the new, and SF for a long time gave us the new, the novum, the new thing. The audience for science fiction, so it stopped evolving and returning to the long established tropes and the resurgence of the idea of space opera, travel narrative, as the basis and as the key identifier of SF. But as the mass media of marketing told the audience that the newly produced was the same as the new, and there's a very important difference there, a misunderstanding if there ever was one, we hit a problem. The age of postmodernity, of the collaging of past tropes instead of the creation of new ones, was upon us. So something might be new in terms of chronology, but it wasn't new as an idea. So since the 1980s, we and science fiction are no longer modern, but we are postmodern, contemporary instead. So SF from the late 1980s on should not be described as modern SF, it's contemporary or postmodern SF. If you look at the world of fine art, books about art produced after the 1980s, that's not the books produced after the 1980s, the art produced after the 1980s are labelled contemporary art, not modern art. And this is what we should do with science fiction, because something changed in the 80s. The pace of new ideas slowed down and traditionalism began to rear its ugly head again. So this is the historical chronology of SF. Proto-SF, scientific romance, genre SF, modern SF, and contemporary SF, and the slipstream. So genre SF then became modern SF and contemporary SF. These are all forms of genre SF, and outside them is the slipstream. And now there is more science fiction published in the slipstream than there is within the genre. The end of modernity suggests that innovation has nowhere left to go, and that newness in the arts arose, burned out very, very quickly between 1850 and 1990, just as the means to spread it to everybody through those mass media constructs of audio recording, television, film, photography, and so on, that overexposed everything really, really quickly, and SF is the same. So all the new ideas got used up really quickly, and an expectation was created in us that we wanted the new. So if you're the sort of person who's not satisfied with science fiction roaring back into the past through Star Wars, Star Trek and space opera, then you're going to find things pretty grim now, and that's how I find them. What is the answer to this? Well, maybe the only answer to postmodernism is the incurable illness of Romanticism. Where do we go from here? Well, we'll discuss slipstream in another video, but that is the true historical context of SF. If you can't see science fiction in historical terms, in terms of progress, then you can't evaluate it. This is a stop, and it leads us to the question of whether science fiction, like modernity, is over.